My wife Nina and I both grew up in Sunshine Orphanage. In that place where, even in winter, heating meant a few kids huddling under one quilt and rubbing against each other to make warmth with body heat, Nina and I had been friends since we were 5. Back then she would grab my bread and I would snatch her candy. Later, we got into college together, worked part-time jobs together, and stood before a wishing well together, promising that one day we would have a little home of our own. 2 years ago, we got married. There were no luxury cars to pick us up, no expensive diamond rings, only a pair of matching pillows sewn for us by the orphanage's old director, and the drunken blessings of a few friends who had played with us since childhood. After we married, we gave everything we had and finally bought a 60-square-meter 2-bedroom at the edge of this city where every inch costs a fortune. Though the mortgage presses on us every month like 2 hunched snails, every evening when I come home from work and see the kitchen glowing with the warmth of cooking, I feel as if my whole life has been filled with honey. "Nina," I said, picking up that piece of meat and cutting off a large chunk to shove into her mouth, "the headmistress at our courtyard posted a video today. She said Miles and Ruby both took first place in their exams this year. They really liked the batch of books we bought." Nina chewed the meat, her eyes crescent-shaped like the moon. "That's good. When the bonuses come next month, let's buy the courtyard 2 more stoves. Winter is coming and the kids' hands get frostbitten easily." "All right, whatever you say." I smiled and ruffled her hair. Actually, both of us harbor a small regret in our hearts. Sometimes when we stroll through the supermarket and see somebody's precious, chubby baby sitting in a shopping cart, calling Mama and Papa in a milky voice, Nina's eyes light up and her steps slow. I know she wants a child. I do too. But every time after we finish paying and look at the pathetic 4 digits left in the passbook, we both instinctively swallow the topic whole. One night Nina leaned against me and murmured, "Merrick, we really can't risk having one right now. We struggled and we know what a child faces without parents who can support them. We have to give our future baby a secure home, we can't have him born into eating instant noodles with us." I held her tightly and planted a kiss on her forehead. "I know. We're not in a hurry. It's just the 2 of us relying on each other. Let's get through the present, save up, and later we'll have enough kids to make a soccer team." "Not a chance." "A football team, do you take me for a sow?" Nina laughed as she pinched my waist. This was the life Nina and I led, simple, tight on money, yet like well-aged wine, every sip was sweet. Back then I could never have imagined that the vast Shingshire group where Nina and I worked, the place where we toiled as the most inconspicuous clerks and administrative assistants on the building's ground floor, would have an inextricable blood tie to me. Even less could I have foreseen that fate, the most unreliable of playwrights, was holding an absurd script and waiting not far ahead to hit me over the head with it. Nina and I both work at Shingshire Group. To be precise, we do odd jobs at one of the company's most peripheral subsidiaries. Shingshire Group is the city's leading enterprise. Its headquarters skyscraper soars 88 stories, while we are merely the 2 most insignificant screws in that magnificent structure. That evening the sky was heavy and it drizzled. To save a few yuan on bus fare, Nina and I, as usual, chose to walk home. We took a secluded little path, hardly anyone used it, but it was the shorter route. "Merrick, there's free braised pork at the company cafeteria tomorrow, eat plenty, you've seemed to be losing weight lately." Nina linked her arm with mine and hopped along, cheerfully making plans. "No problem, I'll bring my own Tupperware." Before I could finish, a violent crash of breaking glass rang out not far ahead, followed by coarse curses and a woman's exclamation. "Smash it! Smash it to death! Today we'll teach that bitch a lesson." I yanked Nina and slipped into the shadow of a side alley. Under the dim streetlights, I saw a black top-of-the-line Bentley stopped ahead, now completely boxed in by 3 vans. 7 or 8 men in black, faces twisted with fury and wielding iron bars, were savagely smashing the car windows. Beside the Bentley, a bodyguard in a suit lay knocked to the ground, his head split and bleeding, yet he still clung desperately to one of the assailant's legs. At that moment the car window glass shattered with a crash, and a young woman with a cool, pale face and a crisply professional outfit was being roughly dragged out of the car by the thugs. "Help!" Panic flickered in her eyes, but her voice remained forceful. do you know who I am? How dare you lay a hand on me? Heh, Miss Yolanda, you're the one they want. Someone's paying for a leg, so blame yourself for getting in the way. The scar-faced leader spat viciously, raising an iron bar to smash down on the woman's leg. Seeing that, my head buzzed. Nina. Call the police. Get behind cover. I practically shouted on instinct. In this secluded alley, if we didn't stop them, that woman would definitely die here tonight. Merrick. Be careful. Nina went pale with fright, but trusting me completely, she didn't hesitate. She immediately pulled out her phone, ducked behind an abandoned oil drum, and called the police. I scanned my surroundings, grabbed a rusty iron water pipe from the pile of trash by the road, took a deep breath, and shouted at the top of my lungs, "Police! There are cops coming. You're surrounded." The shout was piercing and loud, echoing down the alley. The thugs were clearly startled and all turned their heads. When Scarface saw there was only me holding a scrap of pipe, he realized he'd been tricked and flew into a rage. What brat dares to die? Hit him. Two guys with iron rods lunged at me. To be honest, I'm no fighting master, but I grew up in an orphanage and fought plenty of other kids scrambling for turf. My one advantage was that I was tough, could take a beating, and wasn't afraid to die. Bang. An iron rod slammed hard into my shoulder. The agony made me suck in a cold breath, but I gritted my teeth and, using the momentum, swung a fire hose and struck the man's cheek. He let out a miserable scream and crumpled to the ground. Another thug took the chance to kick me in the stomach. I flew backward, slammed into the wall, and felt my insides shift out of place. Watch out. The surrounded woman looked at me in shock, as if she hadn't expected a stranger to risk his life to save her. Don't just stand there watching, run. I wiped the blood from the corner of my mouth, bared my teeth, forced myself up, and like a madman charged again, grabbing the scar-faced man's waist and hurling him to the ground. Let go of me, damn you. The scar-faced man swung his fist and savagely beat my back and head. I was struck so hard my ears rang and my vision swam, as if stained red with blood, but I gritted my teeth and refused to let go. As long as I could hold on until the police arrived, as long as I could. Don't move. Police. Hands up. The shrill wail of the siren finally sounded like a godsend. The dim alley was instantly lit up by flashing red and blue lights. Nina led several armed officers rushing in. Police. Help my husband. The moment I saw the police rushing up, the taut string of nerves inside me finally relaxed, everything went black and I completely collapsed to the ground. Just before I lost consciousness, in a hazy blur I saw the young woman I had rescued take off her coat and drape it over me. Those eyes that were always so cold held an astonishingly complex light. When I woke, the smell of strong disinfectant filled my nostrils. Merrick. You scared me to death. The moment I opened my eyes, I saw Nina with a face streaked with tears like a tabby cat. She was clutching my hand, her eyes rimmed red. I moved my body, pain ached everywhere, especially in my shoulders and ribs, but at least nothing was broken. I forced out an ugly smile. I'm fine, honey, look, I'm alive and kicking, aren't I? Those guys, were they caught? They were all caught. The police praised you as a brave young man who did the right thing. Nina wiped her tears into a smile, gave me a gentle pat, then, worried, helped straighten my blanket. At that moment the ward door was pushed open. Two people walked in. One was the woman I had rescued last night. She had a slight bandage on her head, but her presence was still overwhelmingly powerful. Standing beside her was a woman of about 50, well-preserved though with a haggard face. She was dressed with refined propriety, but her eyes betrayed a deep fatigue and sorrow. Hello, I'm Yolanda, the one who was rescued last night, the young woman said without preamble, her tone carrying an uncommon gentleness. This is my mother. Miss Yolanda, and, hello. Nina and I hurried to greet them. I even tried to sit up, but Yolanda reached out to stop me. Lie still and don't move. You're hurt, Yolanda said. However, from the moment she stepped through the door, Mrs. Sharon's gaze was fixed intently on my face. At first she looked shocked, then incredulous, and finally her whole body began to tremble violently. Those eyes that had seemed so lifeless suddenly welled up with a flood of tears. "Son," Mrs. Sharon's lips quivered as she took step after step toward my hospital bed, her expression dazed, as if she were witnessing some kind of miracle. Nina and I were completely stunned. "Auntie, are you all right?" She was staring at me in a way that made me uncomfortable, even a little creeped out. Had my face, swollen from being slapped, somehow started to resemble one of the family's dead pets? Mrs. Sharon reached out with a trembling hand, as if to touch my face. The affection and despair in her eyes were almost overflowing. "Mom." Yolanda reacted quickly and immediately noticed her mother's abnormal state. She caught her mother as she was about to collapse, looked at me deeply, a flash of extreme shock passing through her eyes before she forcibly suppressed it. "Sorry, Merrick, my mother hasn't been well lately. Her emotions are a bit unstable." Yolanda forced herself to stay calm, her tone snapping back to businesslike. "For saving my life, I will repay you handsomely. This is my card. You should rest now, we'll come to visit another day." With that she almost half-forced my mother, who was still dazed and kept looking back at me, out of the ward. The door closed. The ward was dead silent. Nina and I exchanged a glance, and in each other's eyes we saw the same deep bewilderment. Nina touched my forehead. "Merrick, did you perhaps save some very important person? And, the way that aunt looked at you, didn't it seem like she was looking at her own son?" I gave a bitter smile and said, "Don't be ridiculous. I'm just an orphan, I don't even know who my real parents are. Maybe that lady is grieving and mistook me for someone else." Yet we had no idea that at this very moment, at the end of the hospital corridor, something was happening that would turn everything upside down. "Yolanda. It's him. It's him." Mrs. Sharon clutched her daughter's arm tightly, crying with a pain that tore her apart. "That's your brother. That's your brother whose childhood name was Bowen. His eyes, his eyebrows, it's exactly like your father when he was young. I would never mistake him in a dream." Yolanda supported her mother, her own eyes reddening. For 20 years, her mother had every year sought out the top forensic artists and portraitists to extrapolate from her brother's baby photos what he would look like at 5, 10, 15, 20, 25. Those portraits covered the walls of her mother's private room. Yolanda had looked at them for a full 20 years. The moment she saw Merrick, Yolanda's heart nearly stopped. The face bore an astonishing resemblance to the 26-year-old rendering in the portraits. Yolanda drew a deep breath, a cheetah-like sharpness flashing in her eyes. "Mom, you calm down first. If he really is my brother, then last night's ambush was definitely not a coincidence. That bitch Mabel and her illegitimate son are going to be very restless." Yolanda took out her phone and called her personal assistant, her tone ice-cold as frost. 3 things. First, immediately pull all employee records under Shengshur Group and search for a person named Merrick. I want his entire history from childhood to now, every moment, not a single second missed. Second, thoroughly investigate the gang of thugs who attacked me last night, leave no stone unturned. I want ironclad proof that Mabel ordered them. Third, get the best DNA testing agency ready and on standby. She hung up, and Yolanda looked at her mother, who was crying her eyes out, and said softly, "Mom, if it's him, this time I will never let him go again." The next few hours felt like shooting a science fiction movie to Nina and me. Nina and I were in the ward eating the plain hospital meals the nurses had brought when the ward door was suddenly flung open with a bang. Mrs. Sharon had returned. This time she brought no one with her. Eyes rimmed red, she stumbled in as if drunk with grief. Before Nina and I could fully process it, and with expressions of utter shock, this high society lady, brand name labels all over her, bearing the air of nobility, swept me into her arms. Tears fell like beads broken from a string onto my hospital gown. "Child, my poor child. You've suffered. Let mother see, is your head badly hurt? Does it hurt?" Mrs. Sharon cried as she spoke, using those impeccably kept hands to feel my face and arms everywhere. The pity in her eyes almost took on substance. I was completely petrified. The spoon in Nina's hand clattered to the floor. I froze, my hands held stiffly, not daring to put them down. Mrs. Sharon. Auntie. Are you sure you've got the wrong person? My name is Merrick, I'm an orphan, not your son. Mrs. Sharon was beside herself, gripping my hand tightly. You are my Bowen. 26 years. Mom has been looking for you for 26 years. It was that wicked woman who stole you away. Mom didn't abandon you, Mom thinks about you every day. Nina and I exchanged glances, an aristocratic melodrama. Stolen away. 26 years. The whole thing sounded suspiciously like the trashy soap operas Nina likes to binge. Auntie, please don't get so worked up, let's talk this through. Nina edged closer carefully, trying to soothe Mrs. Sharon. Just then, the ward door opened again and Yolanda came in, dusty and breathless. In her hand she held a thick stack of files. Mom, take it easy, don't startle him. Yolanda went to the bedside, looking at me with a complicated expression, then handed the files to Mrs. Sharon and gave a copy to me as well. Merrick, 26, raised from childhood in the Sunshine Orphanage, after graduating university joined Xingshi Group's third subsidiary as a clerk, wife Nina, also from Sunshine Orphanage. Yolanda read my file, every word and sentence was unbearably clear. Yolanda looked at me, a tremor she could barely suppress in her voice. Merrick, you truly are an orphan. And we are the ones who control Xingshi Group. 26 years ago, shortly after my brother's 1-month birthday, he was snatched by the nanny and has been nowhere to be found ever since. I swallowed. Miss Yolanda, there are plenty of people who look alike in this world. That doesn't prove anything, does it? You're right, resemblance alone cannot be used as legal evidence. Yolanda swept her hand decisively, and 2 doctors in white coats carrying professional medical kits immediately walked into the ward. Yolanda looked at me. So I brought DNA testers. Merrick, although intuition and the record suggest there's a 90% chance you are my brother, for thoroughness and to ease your doubts we need to do a parentage test. The doctor very quickly collected blood samples and oral mucosa swabs from me and Mrs. Sharon. Throughout the whole process, Mrs. Sharon kept gripping my other hand as if, the moment she let go, I would vanish into thin air just like 26 years ago. How soon can we get the results? Yolanda asked the doctor. Miss Yolanda, expedited, results within 3 hours. The doctor replied respectfully. Those 3 hours of waiting were the longest and strangest 3 hours of my life. Mrs. Sharon, no, if the plot is to be believed, she might as well be my birth mother, sat at my bedside the whole time. One moment she asked whether I had enough to eat as a child, the next whether the heating was sufficient in winter. When she heard that Nina and I ate dry bread every day to save money and couldn't afford a big house, this wealthy matron cried so many times she nearly fainted. And Nina and I were in a state of deep existential doubt, who am I, where am I, what am I supposed to do? Nina leaned close to my ear and, in a voice so soft that only the 2 of us could hear, whispered, Merrick, if you really are some rich heir, then, do you not have to eat those cheap loaves that are so dry they could choke you? I shot her a look. What are you thinking? If it's a misunderstanding, we'll be so embarrassed later we'll be able to pick out a 3-bedroom apartment with our toes. 3 hours later, the doctor pushed the door open again. At that moment, the normally noisy ward fell so silent you could hear a pin drop. The doctor held a sealed appraisal report in his hand. Yolanda's fingers tightened slightly, Mrs. Sharon trembled so nervously her whole body shook, and even I couldn't help but hold my breath. No one dared to take the report. The expectations were so high that the fear of the pain of disappointment only deepened. Let me read it. Sensing the heavy atmosphere, the doctor drew a breath, opened the seal, flipped straight to the last page, and read aloud, based on DNA locus comparison and following Mendelian inheritance principles, the results support a biological parent-child relationship between Sharon and Merrick, with a paternity probability of 99.99%. Boom. That final 99.99% detonated like a bomb, exploding through the room. My son. Mrs. Sharon could no longer control herself, she grabbed me tightly and sobbed uncontrollably. That was 26 years of pent-up, life-and-death maternal love erupting completely in this moment. That's wonderful, wonderful. Heaven has eyes. Heaven has eyes. Yolanda, the usually aloof and domineering female CEO, couldn't help but have her eyes redden. She turned away and wiped the tears streaming down her face. And I, held in that warm embrace, felt the scalding tears fall onto my neck. For some reason, the hard defenses I'd built up utterly collapsed at that instant. Orphan, the label that had accompanied me for 26 years, was torn to shreds by that cry. I lifted my somewhat stiff hand and gently patted my mother, who was sobbing into my arms, on the back, then whispered, "Mom." That single "Mom" made Mrs. Sharon cry even louder, but also made her feel even more blissful. Nina, standing beside us, had long since been moved to tears. She dabbed her eyes with a tissue and grinned like a fool. Once emotions had settled, Yolanda, whom I should now properly call sister, led me out into the corridor outside the ward. Nina stayed inside with our still emotional mother. Yolanda's expression grew unbearably serious. "Merrick, there are things I have to tell you now. Our family situation is far more complicated than you think." I nodded. "Sister, tell me." Hearing me call her sister softened Yolanda's eyes and the corner of her mouth involuntarily lifted, but she quickly returned to a hard expression. 26 years ago, the person who stole you was the housemaid. And that maid was bought off by Dad's mistress, Mabel. A flash of hatred passed through Yolanda's gaze. Mabel. Yes. Mabel also had a son back then, named Tyler. To make sure her bastard could smoothly inherit the family business, she deliberately hatched the wicked plan to steal you away and abandon you. That nanny took the money and then vanished completely. I only recently found leads on her. I frowned and said, "What about Dad?" "He just let this mistress run amok." Yolanda sighed, her tone a mix of helplessness and coldness. "Dad, in business he's a legend, but when it comes to feelings he's completely clueless. Mabel once saved his life, so over the years, even though Mom and I have hinted countless times, openly and subtly, that Mabel was trouble, Dad has pampered her relentlessly, even putting Tyler into an executive position in the group. Over the years I've risked everything to buy influence within the group and fight for shares, all to prevent Mabel and her son from hollowing out the family business, and so that when the day came I found you, I could give you a strong backing." As she said this, Yolanda looked at me intently. "Those who attacked me last night were sent by Mabel. Father is gravely ill now, barely holding on. She was in a rush to get rid of me so she could claim the estate for herself. But she never expected that in trying to eliminate me, she'd instead send you back into our lives. This was heaven's cycle of cause and effect. Retribution is inevitable." "Where is Father now?" I asked. Yolanda snorted coldly. "The intensive care unit. Let's go, I'll take you to see him. Some accounts need settling today." In the top-tier VIP ward, I saw my biological father, the founder of the Gushing Group, Howard. He lay in the hospital bed, hooked up to a tangle of machines, his face gaunt and drained of the commanding presence he once had in the business world. Seeing Yolanda leading me in, Howard forced his eyes open. In a weak voice he managed, "Yolanda, who is this?" When his gaze fell on my face, Howard's pupils suddenly constricted. That face, cut from almost the same mold as mine, combined with the identical expression between my brows and the way he had looked in his youth, no words were needed. Some blood-deep intuition made him understand my identity in an instant. A flood of old tears rose in Howard's cloudy eyes. He trembled as he tried to lift a hand. "Bowen. Is that you? Bowen." I stood by the bedside, looking at this old man plugged full of tubes, on the brink of death. To be honest, I didn't have deep feelings for this father. When I heard my sister recount those past events, I even felt a measure of resentment at his bewilderment. "It's me," I answered calmly. Howard sobbed, tears streaming down his face like a helpless child. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry, child." Daddy was confused. "Daddy is sorry to you and to your mother. Daddy failed, abandoned you all these years. Do you hate Daddy? Call me names, then." Seeing the remorse writ across him, much of the anger inside me suddenly dissipated. For someone about to reach the end of their life, hatred no longer held any meaning. I stepped to the bedside and said softly, "I don't hate you, but I can't say I've forgiven you either. You gave me life, though you were negligent. I'm living well now. In these final days of yours, I'll come to be with you through the end. Consider this my way of repaying the gift of life you gave me." Hearing my words, Howard trembled all over with emotion and kept saying, "Good, good. Daddy's satisfied. Daddy's satisfied." At that moment, Yolanda sneered and tossed a thick stack of evidence and paternity reports from her bag onto the bedside table. Yolanda's voice was icy. "Dad, take a good look. This is the paternity test between that woman and Merrick. Also, last night Mabel hired a gang of thugs to try to kill me on the road. If Merrick hadn't risked his life to save me, the two bodies you'd be seeing today would be his and mine." "What?" Howard was struck as if by lightning, his eyes widening as he stared at the evidence on the table. The records of financial transactions between Mabel and the underworld figures, the chat screenshots, every word, every line, were ironclad proof. That wicked woman, she actually tried to harm you. Howard coughed violently in rage, and the cardiac monitor began to sound urgent alarms. All his life he had thought Mabel was his savior, his confidant. He never expected he had raised a wolf that preyed on people. She almost killed his only legitimate heir and beloved daughter. "Call a lawyer. Get Lawyer Zhang here now." Howard roared with all his strength. 10 minutes later, the private attorney arrived at the ward. In a state of extraordinary lucidity, Howard drew up his final will on the spot. "All my Xingshi Group shares, properties, and trust funds are to be inherited equally by my eldest daughter Yolanda and my eldest son Merrick. As for Mabel and Tyler, strip Tyler of all his positions within the group, leave him only with shares in a marginal subsidiary that posts losses year after year, and let it wither on its own. Effective immediately." The moment he finished the will, Howard seemed to have drained every last ounce of strength. He collapsed heavily onto the bed, yet there was a hint of relief and release in his eyes. 3 days after signing the will, Howard passed away peacefully. At his funeral, Mabel and her son Tyler, dressed in mourning, stormed in making a scene, accusing the will of being a forgery and demanding to seize the estate. But Yolanda gave them no quarter whatsoever. "Ms. Mabel, your performance can end now." Yolanda sneered and made a gesture. Several uniformed police officers immediately walked in from outside the funeral, cold handcuffs clamped onto Mabel's wrists. "Mabel, you are suspected of child abduction from 26 years ago, and of hiring a killer 3 days ago. Please come with us." The officer produced an arrest warrant. Mabel went deathly pale and collapsed to the ground as if bereft. And that arrogant illegitimate son Tyler, having lost his mother and the protection of his family, was utterly reduced to a laughingstock in the circle, left to guard that rotten satellite office and live a life of chaos and calamity. Justice may be delayed, but it will never be absent. A month later, with my sister Yolanda's strong assistance, I formally entered the Xingshi Group headquarters and took over part of the management duties. From a lowest-level clerk to a vice president of the group, this shift in status left me extremely unaccustomed at first. But fortunately I was smart and eager to learn, and with my sister, a powerhouse in the business world, teaching me hand in hand, I quickly found my footing and got the company running like clockwork. However, no matter how my status changed, my relationship with Nina never altered in the slightest. To make up for the 20-plus years of emotional absence with my mother, Nina and I moved into the grand villa where she lived. To compensate for the simplicity of our wedding back then, my mother personally took charge and arranged a lavish ceremony for Nina and me. The wedding day was bright and sunny. The old director sat in the front row with the children from the orphanage, grinning from ear to ear. Nina wore a custom-made pure white wedding gown, beautiful like a fairy. I held her hand as we walked down the long red carpet. Nina looked at me, tears glinting in her eyes. "Merrick, I feel like I'm dreaming right now." I squeezed her hand gently and teased, "What? Don't like being a rich family's young madam? Shall we go back now and eat dry bread instead?" Nina turned her tears into a smile and pinched me. "In your dreams. I'm now the wife of a billionaire CEO. If it's dry bread, it has to come with 2 sausages. After the wedding, Nina and I didn't indulge in the ostentatious life of the wealthy. Nina and I reached a mutual agreement. Every year, Nina and I would each contribute 10 million yuan to establish the Sunshine Charity Fund, dedicated to supporting children in orphanages across the country, so they would have food, schooling, and medical care when sick. We had once stood in the rain in the dark, so now we wanted to hold an umbrella for more people. Our comfortable life hadn't changed our original intentions, but it had completely solved our greatest worry. We finally dared to have a child. A year later. With an incredibly loud wail outside the delivery room, Nina and I welcomed our first child. He was an extremely healthy, chubby little boy. The whole family erupted the moment the doctor brought the baby out. But the happiest of all was my mother. Looking at that pink little thing in the swaddling, my mother cried uncontrollably, her hands shaking as she held the child. He looks exactly like him. Just like Merrick as a child. Thank God for giving my son back to me, and for sending me this little treasure. The regret of losing her son 26 years ago was, in this moment, completely filled by the arrival of this new life. In the hospital room, Nina lay weakly in bed, watching her mother cling to the baby with obvious delight. A trace of tenderness and deep thought flickered in her eyes. When my mother took the baby next door to bathe, Nina called me to the bedside. She took my hand and said earnestly, "Merrick, there's something I want to discuss with you." I smiled and tidied the stray hairs on her forehead. "Tell me, my wife. Whatever I can do, I'll do it. I plucked the moon from the sky for you." Nina rolled her eyes at me and said, "Look, you've just taken over the group's affairs. Many projects are in a stabilization phase and my sister can't handle it all alone, she needs help. Although my background is in administration, I've worked at the grassroots level in the group and know the situation there best. Once I recover, I want to return to the group to help you." I frowned. "That would be too hard on you. What about the child?" Nina smiled, her eyes incredibly sincere. "Merrick, our mother suffered for half her life after losing you. It's a wound in her heart she could never heal. Did you see the way she looked when she was holding the baby just now? She truly had her whole being focused on the child. What I mean is, let's entrust the baby to mom's full-time care. That way she can finally move past the shadow of those years and make up for not having raised you. We'll also free up energy to focus on our careers and be better able to help the children at the orphanage. What do you think?" After Nina said that, I was completely stunned. I stared at her blankly, a surge of gratitude and admiration swelling inside me that I couldn't put into words. My wife, she is always so kind, so considerate. Not only does she love me deeply, she wraps my family in the greatest kindness she has. My eyes stung, and I suddenly pulled her into my arms, my voice a little hoarse. "Nina, thank you, really thank you. That I can marry you in this lifetime, it's the luck I earned by saving the galaxy." "You fool," always mouthing off. Nina leaned on my shoulder, smiling very sweetly. When we told my mother the decision, this usually noble and elegant lady of the wealthy family was so moved she began to cry on the spot. Mother held Nina's hand, crying like a child. "Nina, my dear child. Thank you for trusting Mom. I will cherish this child like a treasure. I will never let him suffer an ounce of grievance." From that day on, my mother found a new purpose in life. She was no longer gloomy. Every day she pushed the baby carriage around the neighborhood, boasting to anyone who would listen about how clever her grandson was and how dutiful her daughter-in-law had been. She seemed at least 10 years younger. Nina and I fought side by side in the workplace. I blazed the trail up front while she provided quiet support from behind. Together we not only solidified the Xingshi Group's position, but also made the group's charitable work resonate nationwide. Years slipped by and time flew. We had once thought that having one child, for a family like ours that used to scrimp and save, was already the perfect blessing. But fate seemed to think it had owed Nina and me too much, and decided to make it up to us all at once in the second half of our lives. 3 years later, Nina gave birth to our second child, a pretty little girl. 5 years later, our third child arrived, a mischievous little rascal. 7 years later, when Nina hurled that positive pregnancy diagnosis at me, half laughing, half crying, I was completely stunned. The fourth child was on the way. That day the house was full of laughter and noise, as lively as a small daycare. On the living room rug, our eldest son was solemnly teaching our second daughter how to do her homework. My third son was riding on my back like a horse, shouting, "Giddy up! Giddy up!" And my mother was holding the baby, just a month old, her face radiant with the most satisfied, most brilliant smile in the world. Sister Yolanda had driven home from work in her luxury car. The moment she stepped in, she was surrounded by the three little ones calling her auntie. The cool, aloof female CEO instantly transformed into a doting aunt, pulling out all manner of odd-shaped toys from her bag. Nina came out of the kitchen carrying a freshly prepared plate of fruit. Looking at the chaotic yet utterly warm scene before her, the corner of her mouth curved into a touching smile. I finally managed to shake the little brat off my back and hand him to my sister, then walked over to Nina and naturally slipped my arm around her waist. Nina turned her head to look at me, her eyes soft enough to melt ice and snow. "Merrick, do you remember how we used to act when we shared a piece of meat?" I smiled and kissed her on the cheek. "How could I forget? You told me then that we'd depend on each other for life, that we wouldn't dare have children for fear they'd suffer along with us." Nina gazed around at the room full of laughter and warmth with a wistful look. "Yes, back then I thought quietly keeping our little home was the best we could hope for. I never imagined heaven would give us such a huge surprise." I squeezed her hand and looked at her earnestly. "This isn't a surprise from heaven, it's what we deserve. Because kind people will, in the end, be treated gently by this world." Outside, the sun was setting in the west, and golden afterglow filled the entire living room. The children were playing and fooling around without a care. My mother was humming an old lullaby, my sister was wrestling with the kids for toys, and my beloved wife and I had our fingers intertwined. From the cold winds of the orphanage to the fireworks of high society, from the bitterness of relying on each other to the completeness of welcoming our four treasures. In this life, I have been very fortunate. No matter how wildly fate has shifted and changed, the person who loves me most, and the person I love most, have always been by my side.